Now on CHM Revolutionaries.
We want to connect with people. This technology is allowing us to connect constantly. And what we're feeling, I think, is a lot of pressure that we have to connect.
As screen time redefines human connection and the compulsive need to refresh hijacks our collective mindshare, what are the lasting effects? Is technology reconfiguring the human brain? Journalist Lisa Krieger is joined by a panel of experts to discuss how technology influences the developing brain, the use of technology in classrooms, and a growing cultural anxiety brought on by constant connectivity.
Good evening. Can everyone hear me? Lisa Krieger here. Thank you for all of you who are Mercury News readers, and I love hearing from you. I think we could all agree we live in really extraordinary times. We're witnessing an explosion in the diversity and the accessibility of these amazing computers that we carry in our pockets and that we have on our desks. And these tools are constantly changing. You know, they're getting smaller and faster and more powerful and becoming really part of our life, and there are more of them, of course. But what I find really interesting about tonight's topic, and I'm just so glad we're here to talk about it, is that we're changing too. You know, we're changing in response to these tools. These tools are changing us, and that's what we'll be talking about tonight, because I think that's pretty extraordinary too. So it's not all doom and gloom. I think we can all agree that we love our computers in our pockets, and that's why we're here, the Computer History Museum. We love it. But there's also emerging evidence that all this technology is really having an adverse effect on our mental health, on our ability to connect with each other, on our attention spans, and our focus. And even more worrisome is there's an effect on young people. And there's an emerging body of research that's exploring that we'll learn about this evening. The timing of tonight's discussion is perfect because those of you who've been reading in the Mercury News and the New York Times just had a big piece too, are some really interesting trends. And back in January, there were two big investors in Apple holding like $2 billion worth of stock that are asking Apple to study the health effects of its products, and also to make it easier for Apple or make it easier for consumers to limit children's use of iPhones and iPads. And then just last week, there were some pediatric and mental health experts that called on Facebook to abandon its messaging system that it is promoting to children as young as 6. As you probably know, the age for Facebook now starts at 13. And then just a few days ago, some early employees of Google and Facebook organized an organization called the Center for Humane Technology. And what they're planning on doing is organizing a lobbying campaign that focuses on addiction to these devices. And then also a education campaign that's focused at like 55,000 schools, public schools. So the view from 30,000 feet up of what we'll talk about tonight, we're going to start with Adam, who will describe the brain, describe what we know about the neurology and physiology of the brain. Larry will talk about our changing patterns of consumption and how that changes from generation to generation. Mary Helen will discuss research on young people that's emerging. And then we'll go back to Larry and Adam and focus more specifically on research they've done about attention spans and focus. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some really practical advice for teachers, for parents, for those of us who use these devices all the time. What do you recommend to keep them from really hijacking our life? But also, what opportunities do they have, and how can we leverage these technologies to make better use of them? So thank you for your interest. And Adam, I'll start with you. Adam has written a lot and spoken a lot, and he once said, "We're ancient brains living in a modern world," and just wondered if you could explain what you mean by that.
Sure. So thank you, everyone, for being here. So I'll take a step back in our evolutionary past and frame this, the beginning of this discussion, from the point of view of the human brain and how it wound up here, and things that are strong about our brain and things that are weak. And I find it really interesting to think about our high-tech world now from that framing, that perspective of the fact that we still have ancient brains. And so given our short time, I'm just going to talk about two aspects of that, although there are many more. So our brains really evolved to do two things: to sense the world around us, and then to respond to it. And even if you look at single-celled animals, you see the precursors of the brain to be able to identify nutrients and toxins, and then move towards or away from them. And as brains evolved, we developed this ability to not respond reflexively to our environment. So very primitive animals and even unicellular creatures, they don't have a choice. There's a toxin, they move away. There's a nutrient, they move towards it. We've evolved what we call cognitive control, and not just humans, other animals as well, which allows us to have some degree of goal-directed control of how we interact with the world around us. So there might be a stimulus, even a strong stimulus, and you could suppress what might be a reflexive response, make a decision about it, and then decide to do something else. And so cognitive control is what allowed us to create everything from our technology itself, music, art, society, language, all would only exist because we're not slaves to our environment. We don't reflexively respond to it. And there are three general abilities that I like to think of that really define what cognitive control is. The first is what we call attention. Attention is our ability to direct our limited mental resources where and when we want them in space and time. You have to be selective. You can't take in all the information around you. And you have to move your attention based on your goals. The other we call working memory. Working memory is not like long-term memory. It doesn't mean you're going to remember it even in an hour. It's just that online memory, to borrow a term from the computer industry, that you use just to basically bridge across perceptual events. So you see something, you're in a conversation, you hear something, and then you just have to get to the next event. So it's what gives us this continuous frame that we're moving through in one unbroken passage. And the third we call goal management, and it's essentially what happens when we have more than one task. How do we multitask or task switch? And we'll talk about that a little bit more later when we talk about the research. And so these abilities are amazing, right? And as I said, if we did not have them, we would never have created anything that we think of as human contributions in any way. But the interesting thing is that they have very fundamental limitations in many ways that do not differ from other animals, certainly other primates. But even rats, when we study them, have attention and working memory and goal management that are not that different if we could push them to do some of the things that we do. So our attention, although we can focus it, still has this susceptibility to distracting influences from things that are very strong in the environment. Someone calls your name, something very novel. It will demand your attention independent of your goals. Working memory has a very limited capacity and resolution. It doesn't equal what we record when we take in information for the first time. And then our ability to task switch or multitask is also very limited. And we'll talk about this in more detail, but we now know with every switch between two goals, there's a degradation of the fidelity of that information that leads to either a decrease in your accuracy or the time it takes you to do that. So these fundamental limitations exist, whether you're aware of it or not. And then we have this other aspect of the human brain that I would say is the pinnacle of what our brains have evolved, which is our goal-setting abilities. We have this amazing capacity to set long goals. You could set a goal 10 years in the future. You could have your goals interwoven with other goals, even interwoven with other people's goals. But what happens is we have these high-level goal-setting abilities, and they essentially collide headfirst with these fundamental limitations in our cognitive control. And this is the core of the dilemma. This is what we refer to as interference, and the basis of the distracted mind, which Larry and I have written about, is this conflict, essentially between what you want to do and what you're actually capable of doing. And it doesn't matter whether you're aware of it or not, this interference creates all sorts of ramifications. So we know that it has a cascading negative impact across the entire domain of what we think of as cognition, from perception to long-term memory, to decision-making, to emotional regulation, is all impaired by this type of interference. And then there are real world consequences related to our safety, our education, workplace, even our relationships with one another. So that's the reality. That's why we say we have distracted minds, because we have these limitations and we have this high-level goal-setting abilities, and they collide to create interference. One last aspect, and I'll keep this one even shorter, of, okay, so we have these limitations. Even if I told you about this, or you already know about it, a lot of people are intuitive enough to feel this conflict, you may do it anyway. Now, there's lots of reasons we behave in ways that we know are bad, so I'm not going to try to make a global statement on that now. But one interesting aspect that we've developed in our book, The Distracted Mind, again, another ancient brain phenomena, is that the human brain and other primates have essentially co-opted ancient reward systems that drove our ancestors to forage for food for survival. We now forage for information, even though it's not for survival. And there's studies that show that the dopamine system is activated in monkeys even for an information reward, in a very similar way to how it's activated for a food or a juice reward. So we are driven, I would say we are information-seeking creatures. And this aspect of our behavior has now been challenged by our technology, just because of this unprecedented access that we have to information. And not just that we could reach for information over there, but your information device might ping you and tell you to pay attention to it. And so I'd say that this conflict between our goal-setting abilities and our cognitive control has always existed. It's not that technology has created it, but I'd say it has aggravated it. And that aggravation of it is sort of inflamed by the fact that we seek out information in such a fundamental way. And so there is sort of the story that I just wanted to share about what's very impressive about our brain, our goal-setting ability, and where these limitations arise, and how technology, due to the exposure to information we have, has sort of aggravated that relationship.
That's a beautiful jumping off point for Larry now. Larry, talk about how our use of technology has changed and how the modern world has really changed what it asks of our brain, and how consumption has changed, what the generational differences. Tell us what you've seen in your research.
So I've been doing this since 1985, when I started studying the impact of technology quite a while ago. And one of the things that we started looking at came from consumer research. In consumer research, when a product hits 50 million people, it's considered to have penetrated society. And when we started looking at the research, most of the products that we were looking at, television, phones, things like that, were taking a decade or more to penetrate society until we hit the World Wide Web. When the World Wide Web came out, it took 4 years to hit 50 million people, which astounded everybody. And then if you watched products come from there, you saw things like MySpace, which took 2 years to hit 50 million people. You saw YouTube, which took 1 year to hit 50 million people. And now as you watch the products come in, you see that things like Angry Birds took 35 days to hit 50 million people, beaten just now by Pokemon Go, which took 10 days to reach 50 million people. So what you can see is technology is coming at us rapidly. Just as a little example, we just did a study where we were looking at social media, and we were asking people in the study, do you have an active account on social media? And which social media sites, and we gave them a long list of all the social media sites. They had more than 80% of the people, the young adults we looked at, had an active account on almost 6 social media sites, meaning they looked at them daily. So you've got this technology that is cascading down on us, and we are reacting. And one of the things that we see is this is driving our behavior. Give you another example from research. In 2008, we asked people to tell us from a list of pairs of tasks, which of these pairs would you be willing or do you typically attempt to do together? So do you attempt to text and eat a sandwich at the same time? Do you attempt to play a video game and read a book at the same time? Obviously very difficult, right? You'd be surprised at some of the young people who say they can do that. So in 2008, we looked at different generations, and not surprisingly, the older generation, of which I'm a member, the baby boomers, said they could do about half of them, roughly, at the same time, or they attempted to do half of them. When you looked at some of the younger generations back when we started this in 2008, they were doing about 70%, and they claimed they could do 70% of them. 6 years later, we did exactly the same study with new people. Those numbers shot up sky high. And in fact, the youngest generation, what we call the I generation, born in the 1990s, claimed that they could do 87% of the pairs at the same time. That's astounding. That included playing a video game and reading a book at the same time. They claimed they could do that. So we're sitting in this world where the temptations are there, the social media accounts are there, the connections, the virtual connections are there. And there's a lot of talk about things like Adam mentioned, the dopamine system, part of the pleasure system, part of the addiction system. There's a lot of talk about whether we are addicted to technology or not, or addicted to our smartphones. And I think that term is thrown around a little too much, because typically when we talk about an addiction, we talk about something that should give us some sort of a good feeling, a pleasurable feeling. It taps into the biochemical system that makes you feel good. I would argue that most of the time that people pick up their phone and look at their phone, they're not getting anything good out of it. They're not feeling pleasure. In fact, what we're starting to see is that they're doing it because there's a buildup of chemicals in their brain and their body that are making them feel this weird kind of anxious feeling. And the anxious feeling is talking to them and saying, wow, I haven't checked in with Facebook for a while, I better check in. Or wow, I have to see if somebody texted me, even though you get notified when you get a text. Wow, I haven't checked my text for a while. So what we see is half the time that people access their phone or access technology, they're doing it because they got an alert or a notification. The other half of the time, they're doing it for no good reason at all. And what we're seeing is that that's more of an obsession or a compulsion. And so I think we're looking at two very different systems, and I think the systems right now are a little out of whack. Two years ago, I had students in one of my large classes put an app on their phone. The app monitored how many times each day they unlocked their phone, swiped it open, put in a code, fingerprint, whatever, unlocked their phone, and how many minutes it stayed unlocked. The typical young adult, ours are young adults 20, 25 years old, the typical young adult unlocked their phone 56 times a day, which is about every 15 minutes roughly of waking time, and for 220 minutes. That's almost 4 hours. We were pretty astounded. A year later, we did the same study with an equivalent group of people. They unlocked their phone 50 times a day. We thought, that sounds better, for 262 minutes. 262 minutes. What are they doing on their phone? When you look at the activities, what they're doing is something to do with connection. Distinctly human, distinctly evolutionary, we want to connect with people. And now we're at a time of life where this technology is allowing us to connect constantly. And what we're feeling, I think, and we're starting to see this, is a lot of pressure that we have to connect, that we feel a responsibility to connect, and that's the anxiety-provoking part. Great. Can I say one other thing? In my lab, we do a lot of research that cuts across a lot of different techniques, anything from observational research to survey work to field work to some of the neuroscience work. And one of the studies that Dr. Nancy Cheever, one of the people in our lab, did on national television with Anderson Cooper was she put a little clip on two of his fingers. One measured heart rate and one measured galvanic skin response, which is arousal. And then what she did is she parked Anderson in front of a computer and said, what I want you to do is just put your phone down to the side, and I'm going to show you a videotape and ask you some questions at the end of the videotape. About 2 minutes in, Nancy said, you know what, Anderson, your phone, the electronics seems to be messing up with our electronics here. We're just going to move it behind you a little bit, just on this table behind you. And then she started texting him. Every single time she texted him, his galvanic skin response spiked. Spike, spike. And then at the end, out of protocol, she called his phone, and galvanic skin response spiked, and he went like this and turned way around trying to see if he could see what was on his phone. That's what's going on with all of us.
That's fascinating, and just how powerful it is. So Mary Helen, this is the world we live in. This is the world that our children are growing up in. What do we know about how technology influences the developing brain socially and biologically?
Yeah, so, thank you. It's really fun to go third because I get all this cool stuff to react to. I think the really interesting question for me here is something else that's very fundamental about the human brain, that's very unique to the adult human brain and adolescent brain to a degree, childhood brain to a smaller and simpler degree, is that we don't just do things in the world. We're not just about reacting and integrating our actions into the current context and engaging in that sort of immediate context-specific way anymore. We do something else that's very uniquely human, and that is that we make meaning out of the things we do. We actually extract common lessons across and build things like beliefs and values and ethics and identities. Things that actually aren't real in the real world at all. They're psychological constructions that we culturally build in the space of our relationships as we subjectively experience them. And I mean that as a verb. I mean the active process by which we mentally become aware of the things that are happening to our galvanic skin response, right? And the emotions that we react automatically to the world with, the way in which we come to feel those emotions is a critical piece of how our mind works. We transcend contexts. We have identities that aren't just here and now, but that are true of us in any place that you put us, hopefully, right? That doesn't mean they're not influenced by the current context. You adapt to the context, but the way in which our children develop and we live in the world is something much more sort of transcendent than that. We have these selves that we build, that we move around with, and that we continually mentally recondition and reconstruct in acculturated ways that are emotional, that are situated, and that allow us to have these really high-level things, like I said before, beliefs and values. So the question that's been really driving a lot of my research in the lab is neuroscientifically, in the course of brain development, how is it that we break out of these reactions to the current world and actually build abstract meaning and narratives about what it all means coming together? And what we've been finding when we study emotions that require you to do this, like, for example, admiration for virtue, right? The admiration you feel for, say, a civil rights leader, where you can look at the person, like let's say somebody like Malala Mustafi. You can look at her and you can see her when she's 12 years old saying like, they can't stop me, I will go to school here, there, or anywhere, right? And you can see her, and a younger child or a young adolescent even, will look at her and say, oh, I hope she gets to go to school, good for her, keep going, even though they shot her in the head, they can't stop her, right? And an older adolescent into an adulthood stops, reacts that way, and then stops and steps back. And we see their attention actually shift. We see their eye gaze away from the stimulus and from the experimenter who's talking to them, and they pause. They lose motor control, they close their posture, they stop moving, they speak more slowly with longer pauses. They say things like instead of words, right? And we all do this. And they roll their eyes away, and then they come back with this report of having integrated the story into the contextual knowledge they have of the circumstance. And they make meaning out of that story that transcends the context, that is no longer about Malala or Pakistan or even the Taliban. It's about human rights. It's about qualities of mind and of character that transcend context, that travel with people, that you have to infer by knowing not just about her story, but about her story in relation to the context in which she's operating and the emotional and cognitive demands that that puts onto her as a person, and therefore what she must be like as a person in terms of her intrinsic character to be able to behave in the way that she is. And what we find is that networks in the brain that are supporting this kind of abstraction, this kind of moving yourself away from the current context in order to make meaning, are, and now hundreds of neuroscientific studies have shown this, are basically incompatible with externally focused attention and motor control, right? So our data make a lot of sense in terms of the big picture of what's being discovered about how the brain supports things like beliefs and values and ethics and identity, these abstract constructions that aren't real, and the ways in which children learn to conjure these things in their mind, right, in age-appropriate, developmentally appropriate ways, right? People are undermined in their ability to engage with these kinds of high-level meaning making when they're constantly reacting to things in the environment. And so the question for us has been, well, what does this mean for the development of children's brains? We know our brains are shaped by the forces of the environment and the cognitive demands we put on them, right? We know that there are systematic differences in brain structure and in brain function that are related to the affordances, right, of the world, the way in which you've been asked to think, and the tools that you have for doing that, like whether or not you know how to read, for example, is changing white matter pathway structures in the brain. And what we set out to try to understand is, are we potentially, by giving kids a world that's demanding their attention to this very high degree that we haven't had before, that's hijacking these very low-level systems for attention, for arousal that Larry and Adam both talked about, for dopamine release, right, for these kind of pleasure responses, if we're hijacking potentially the opportunities for the young brain to develop a balance between externally focused attention and the kind of internally focused attention that allows us to construct narratives about what it all means. And to make a long story really short, we and other labs are now finding really disturbing preliminary evidence that this is in fact potentially the case. That the more kids are engaged with this kind of immediate use of technology, and here it's not the tool that's at fault, it's the way in which you're using the tool, right? Engaging in in-depth conversations with someone on the other side of the world whom you couldn't meet with in person is a completely different use than just having little things pinging at you while you're thinking or while you're with a friend having a real conversation, right? But the more that kids and adolescents specifically are using these technologies in ways where the technology is driving them and stealing and hijacking their attention, as compared to them using it in a mindful, strategic way to gather information that you actually need to enrich your understanding of a situation, right? That kind of balance, moving back and forth between gathering mode that Adam talked about and reflection mode that I'm talking about, that balance, when it's perturbed, when it's shifted, seems to be reflected in the style of morality that kids have, in the way in which they interact with other people, the way in which they represent their own self, the kind of identity, the kind of sense of purpose, the kind of future possible self they describe. So kids who are doing this more are showing less a sort of skewed development in the relative network strength of external attention and reward processing versus internal attention and reflection. And what we're finding is that skew is related to values that are about adulthood, for example, that are much less psychological and much less deep and much more superficial and kind of appearance and action oriented. I want to have this, I want to do that, as compared to I want to be like this, I want to feel like that, I want to have these kind of relationships. And then we're also seeing that it's related to things in educational literatures like a fixed mindset, if you know what that is. So a mindset that you believe that intelligence is something you're born with, that you have or you don't have, and you're either good at things or you're not good at things, as compared to what's called a growth mindset, which is a mind that you believe that you can improve your intelligences if you work hard at them, right? That intelligence is a process that you're responsible for being the custodian of. And what we find is that, again, kids who have this more appearance and action-oriented kind of reactivity to the world and to the social world, not just the online world, but the real world, right, are also showing this more fixed entity kind of appearance, action-oriented view of their own intelligence, which is potentially undermining their ability to work hard in school, for example. So there's a really dynamic kind of problem about that I find just really fascinating. And I think we really, as a culture, need to understand better, which is how we leverage these technologies in ways that we can smartly use them to gather the information we need in the service of something bigger, in the service of relationships that transcend the technological interface, in the service of information that informs our ability to build opinions and beliefs and values, which in turn inform our ability to reflect on and plan our own actions, like we heard about the goal setting that Adam was talking about. So I find that space is a really important place that we're going to have to start to really work hard if we want to understand the impact of technologies on children going forward.
was fascinating. Thank you, Mary Helen. And just briefly, is anyone studying skills that actually take practice and time to learn, like focus, like attention span? Are we studying?
Are we studying the development of those?
Exactly.
Oh, for sure.
Those two specifically.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of good work on that. I don't study that. I study things like admiration, virtue, and compassion, but yeah.
What's the research telling us? Do you know?
You probably know better than me, but I mean, I can take a stab. I mean, practice helps you, right? That's the basic idea. Practice helps you get better attention. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that, our grandparents that could recite poetry and just those kind of skills that this immediate demand for our attention seems to degrade, I would guess, which is actually a great transition to Adam. Thank you. The brain doesn't stop changing at age 18. And what do you see in your research about the adult brain and then the demands on it that Mary Helen just described?
Yeah, so I'll just briefly tell you about some of the work we've done at UCSF on interference. And we tend to think about, so our framework for thinking about interference is to categorize it into two main types.
When you say interference, these are distractions?
Yeah, I'll break it down.
Okay, thank you.
So we think of interference happening internally, where you don't need any stimuli around you to have interference. Interference is something that impedes with anything you're doing, and I'll define that more, or external, coming in around you. And then on both the internal and the external, we divide that into distractions and multitasking. And so just on the internal side, you can have distraction without any stimuli around you, right? Something might pop up in your mind that you didn't intend to think about, and they're often negative, as research has shown, and that pulls you out of a conversation. So you have to, can you say that again, right? You didn't see anything or hear anything, it was an internal distraction. And then you can internally multitask, right? You could make the decision that I think I could listen to you and start planning my dinner at the same time, right? So that's another internal multitasking. Nothing's going on, you're not texting, but you're multitasking, even though the person might or might not be aware of it. In the external world, it's a lot more obvious, and we, again, divide it the same way. Distraction is completely irrelevant information that you're actually trying to ignore. You're trying to have that conversation and ignore all the chatter around you at a restaurant as best you can, filter that out, and engage. Well, multitasking, again, is a decision so that you're going to have this conversation and also eavesdrop at the next table at the same time. So the difference, from our perspective, between distraction and multitasking is about choice. They're both the types of interference. One is that you're really trying to do one thing and information might just get in, whether internally or externally, and the other, you're trying to parallel process. And they're different in the brain. So with distraction, there's two things going on when you pay attention, even if you're not aware of it. One is focus, right? I said before, you have these limited resources. You have to decide where and when you want to place them. But one thing we've learned in our research is that there's another side to it, and that is ignoring. And focus and ignoring, we've shown, are not actually two sides of the same coin. You could be focusing just fine and actually fail to ignore. So they dissociate, which is fascinating. And ignoring is not a passive process. Ignoring is actually an active process to filter out information, whether you're aware of it or not. So that's one thing we found. With multitasking, it's different. So when you're engaged in an attention-demanding activity, and I really qualify that as attention demanding. So you can do more than one thing, like the old chewing gum and walking, although even that is challenging for some people, and not just because, and especially even things that are easy, like talking and walking, which you think is as easy as chewing gum and walking, but we know that's not the case anymore. Talking does demand attention and changes how you walk. But when you're doing more than one attention-demanding activity, you engage a brain network, right? That's how our brain works. It doesn't just work as isolated islands. It works as a network of interactivity. That network, that attentional network, allows you to focus and accomplish what your goal is. If you try to engage in another attention-demanding activity, you will not parallel process it. You will not engage, and we've shown this with functional imaging, and many other labs have shown this too. You will disengage that network and re-engage a new network and switch. Even if you think you're multitasking, your brain is really task switching. And it's with those switches of the networks that you have this degradation of the information, and you have this negative impact, whether you're aware of it or not. So that's just a little bit of neuroscience behind distraction and multitasking. We know that things that you might be shocked about from the distraction point of view degrade performance. We did an experiment where we had healthy 20-year-olds, young adults, like the peak of the pyramid when it comes to these abilities, come into the laboratory, and first we showed them a whole series of pictures that had different numbers of items. And then unbeknownst to them, when they went into the scanner for the second half of the experiment, we actually, said, you saw a frog, an image of frogs. How many were there? And so it's a detailed memory test. They didn't know they had to perform such a detailed test. And we did the test both when their eyes were open, also when their eyes were closed, and when their eyes were open looking at a busy visual picture. And what we found is that even having your eyes open degrades the details of the memories that you can retrieve, even if you're a 20-year-old. If you, we then did that same exact experiment, except we had them do the memory task, a different group of people, in silence, with white noise, like shh, or we taped restaurant chatter. They couldn't hear the words, but it was restaurant chatter. Found the exact same effect, even for visual memories. It doesn't matter what domain it's from. So we are extraordinarily sensitive, and that's not to advise us to walk around with like our eyes closed and earplugs in, but it is to show you that even what you might consider pretty benign sensory information that just exists around us all the time, even that fractures our memory ability. So you can imagine when you layer on the type of activities that we do, what that does. And then the last comment I'll just say, this is sort of a gloomy one, although maybe later we'll return to some of the positive things about technology, is that everything that I just told you gets worse as we get older. All of it. All of it. Many, many labs. This is actually my main area of research is the aging brain. And every aspect of cognitive control, from selective, sustained attention, working memory, task switching, multitasking, it all gets worse. And I'm not talking about some, what is old, 60. I'm talking like not 23 years old anymore. This is a lifetime process that we all get to share together. Really, you don't have very long at what I always think is like the tip of the cognitive pyramid before you start the decline. And not everything declines with age. I mean, things like vocabulary, semantic knowledge, stabilize throughout and really exist for a long time without decay. And then other things like wisdom really even increase. But when we're talking about these fluid cognitive abilities, processing speed, resistance to distraction, working memory, selective attention, they all decline with age. And we've shown in the lab the reason they do is because the filter is not as efficient anymore. We actually showed in a paper, one of my favorite from 2005, that the older participants in our study actually were focusing and paying attention from that point of view, from the focus point of view, as if they were 20. What was changing was their ability to ignore. That's how we first started realizing that they're dissociable mechanisms. And from the point of view of multitasking, what we've learned is that it is the switch between the networks that is just a little bit slower. And even delays of tenths of seconds really matter when it comes to these type of abilities. So that's sort of the foundation of the work we do now, which I'll tell you about a little later, where we say, okay, we understand the vulnerabilities of the brain and how it changes with aging. Now can we use that to try to strengthen the brain so that we can engage with this complex world in a healthier way?
Thank you. Larry, is there anything you'd like to contribute?
Sure. One of the things that I always start my classes with is I tell my students to go home, turn on CNN, and first focus on the speaker, on the journalist, whoever's speaking, and ignore the scroll. But while you're listening to the speaker, try to look at the scroll, and then reverse it. Try to read the scroll, but look at the person's mouth at the same time and try to do it, and try to retain both at the same time. They all come back and say, of course you can't do that. That's impossible. It doesn't work. But this is what we do. 90% of people who watch television second screen, meaning they have some other screen in front of them, usually their phone or tablet or something, and they believe that they can do this. And this is, I think, the interesting part of what all of us are talking about is people really sincerely believe that they can do multiple tasks at the same time. Our data don't lie. The young people believe they can do 87% of those pairs all at the same time. And in fact, we can't. We're just not built that way. And yet we continue to try. We continue to push it. One of the studies that we've done in our lab is we went out and watched kids study. And these were college students, middle school, and high school students. Watch them study. We watched them study in their normal study environment, which, by the way, for almost all of them was their bedroom. We looked at all the technology they had around them on their bed while they were studying, and every minute we noted, was the person studying or not? If they weren't, what were they doing? And we also, I should mention, we told them we wanted them to study something super important, the most important thing they had to study, something that they could really focus on. So here we are, we're sitting behind them, we're watching them, we're with a clipboard, we're marking things down. And I thought, naively, that they would study all 15 minutes. How many minutes did they study out of the 15? About 9. About 9. And how many minutes were they able to study at a time? We looked at runs. Their studying went like this. They studied for a couple minutes, they stopped studying. They studied for a couple minutes, they stopped studying. They studied for a couple minutes, they stopped studying. What kind of way is that to study? That's just not, it's not an efficient way to study, and it's not an efficient way to remember. Then the next year, I didn't want to send out hundreds of observers to do this, so I just asked everybody to observe themselves. I said, for 15 minutes, every minute I want you to set an alarm. Every minute I want you to check off whether you were studying what you said you were going to study or not, and if you weren't studying, what were you doing? Guess how many minutes they studied for? 9. I expected them to lie to me and tell me they studied for 15. They studied for 9. This is intrinsic in what is going on with everybody at all ages. This is what we're seeing. Our attention span, some people have reported that our attention span is shorter than a goldfish. First of all, I didn't know goldfish had an attention span, but evidently they do, and it's about 9 seconds. But we still start seeing results coming from different labs all around the world that our attention span ranges from seconds to minutes at best. And I think this is really important for what Mary Helen was saying also. In order to develop these kinds of beliefs, these kind of values, these kind of morals, you have to be able to attend. You have to be able to focus for more than 3 to 5 minutes at a shot. And I think that should be very concerning to us as we go forward.
Thank you. It's a question for Mary Helen or Larry. Schools are encouraging students to use technology for more and more of their learning. So taking notes and practicing new skills. And this reader writes, even though studies show that may not be the best way to retain information. And how can parents push back? Or what's the research tell us about technology in the classroom?
Yeah, so there is a lot of research now showing that the way people use technology in classrooms might seem efficient, and sometimes efficiency undermines the learning process because you learn by sort of elaboratively representing to yourself and re-representing to yourself and calling back up, you know, the testing effect and things like that are spin-offs of this, are examples of this, right? So having to force yourself to think of something is actually helping you solidify the memory for it. And so, for example, there's quite a few studies showing that if you take notes on a laptop as compared to writing with a pen, depending on your own personal affordances, like if you have really poor handwriting or you've got no arms, right, then a different technology is going to work better for you, right? So you need to really be careful about variability too. But for most people, because it's so efficient, you can mindlessly transcribe what the person's saying, and then you're not forced by the limits of the technology of a pen to pick the important ideas, to connect them with arrows, to build diagrams and more actively organize the information. And so you're sort of just a conduit, right, a pass-through for the information, and that doesn't foster deep learning or memory. So that's an example of using this technologies to be more efficient is not always the best way. You really need to understand, like Adam said, the way in which well, first of all, the goal of the learning process, right? Is it to transcribe the lecture or is it to learn something? And I'm only being this facetious, right? Because sometimes you might want to transcribe the lecture so you've got it in a complete detail later and you can rethink it in your own time. But sometimes, mostly, you want to pick the big ideas, and then you need to think about the person and the variability and their own situation. If they can't write quickly, then maybe this is a better technique for them. But if the typical learner, really, it's so efficient that it's undermining the learning process. So.
Interesting. And Larry, you're a teacher.
It's funny, I want to take it from a bit of a different angle because in college particularly, there's this two groups of professors. Some professors say, no technology at all. Put your phones away, lock everything up, no technology at all. Others say you can use whatever you want. I think they both have problems. But the real issue to me are the ones that say no technology at all. Because what we find is if you take away technology, just like with Anderson Cooper, people start to get anxious, and that anxiety builds. We've taken a look over time, over an hour period of a course where nothing happened. We induced boredom. We told students to sit and do nothing. Do nothing for an hour, and by the way, you can't have your phone. So what did they do? Well, about 10 minutes in, and then about 30 minutes in, and about an hour in, we tested their anxiety level. 10 minutes in, well, let me back up a little. We split them into 3 groups. We called them light users, moderate users, and heavy users. 10 minutes in, 30 minutes in, 60 minutes in, light users, no anxiety, nothing, flat. Moderate users, 10 minutes in, no anxiety. 30 minutes in, a little bit of anxiety, then they level off. They sort of get used to it. It's the heavy users, which are the young kids right now. 10 minutes in, they're already more anxious. 30 minutes in, they're way more anxious. 60 minutes in, they're freaking out. And so if you don't let them use their technology in class, what happens is they literally stop thinking. They stop paying attention. So one of the things that I talk about a lot in doing in class, and I get a little bit of bad rap over this, is that you can build in technology times during the class. So you can say, 20 minutes into the class, okay, everybody take a minute technology break. Take a look at whatever you want for a minute, then put it away again. Now that may seem silly, it may seem like we're coddling these students, but in fact what it does is it drops that anxiety like, boom, now they don't feel anxious. And by the way, I just looked up the statistics today before I came up here, and anxiety disorders have just passed up depression as the #1 mental health problem among teenagers.
Wow.
And something like 30% of teenagers will report some sort of anxiety disorder within this year. So anxiety is rampant.
So do you think technology is contributing to that?
And I was going to say, and I think technology plays a very strong role in this.
Yeah. Wow.
And it very much concerns me because a lot of what they're anxious about, it seems, is they're anxious about all the things that are contained in this little box that's in their pocket or purse or arm or hand or whatever. And those are different than the things that are right in front of them. They're missing the world, and they're missing the people in front of them, and the nature in front of them. They're missing everything.
That's right. Quick question. We could spend a whole hour on this, and we won't. But what about online learning versus class learning? There are these giant MOOCs. Are they as effective in instruction?
The research that I've seen shows that they're not, that the attrition rate is huge.
Okay. And what's that about, do we suppose?
Well,
because there's not the engagement.
I think it's so easy to get distracted. If you're not, if you're not in a classroom learning and it's your personal responsibility to log on, watch the lectures, to do the homework, it's just too easy to get distracted, and then you get distracted enough and you get farther and farther behind, and then you fail. Interesting.
And Mary Helen, any?
It comes back to the way the person is engaging with that technology. So, and the MOOC answer actually segues into this perfectly. So it depends on the person's ability to engage with that technology around the goal of learning that content. If they can manage that on their own, which I would say a preschooler is definitely not capable of doing, okay, then they can use that technology as a really great access to learning. So if you're a housewife in rural Kansas and you never got to go to college, this is a fantastic way to tap into SC, and you can take a class or some other institution, right? And you can take a class and meet other people from other places who are thinking about the same stuff as you, and you can have rich discussions and you can engage, right, in these classrooms vicariously. Whereas if you don't have that value for that learning and that metacognitive ability already within you strongly enough that you can manage the distraction, then it's going to be a failure for you. So it's about the developmental ability of the person to engage with the learning. If you need a lot of support, it's not going to work well for you. But if you know exactly what you want and why you're there, then it can be a great enabler of access to resources and education.
So here's a pro-technology question for young people. Does technology help processing speed of the brain? For example, kids that play certain kinds of video games seem to react faster to visual stimuli.
Yeah, I could fill that one.
Yeah. Who'd like to take a run at that?
So this is a way longer conversation than we have time for, but I'll share a little bit of it with you. This is subject that's actually very near and dear to my heart, and most of my research activities are related to this bigger concept that can we develop technologies, even technologies that we're already familiar with, in a way that helps them enhance aspects of what makes us human and not degrade it. That's sort of one of my big missions now. And one of the areas that I've entered now from a research perspective is the use of video games, interactive media, to talk more broadly, as tools that help how our brains function. We don't do research with consumer video games, so I can't speak to it so deeply, but I have many colleagues that do. And I was actually inspired by some of that research that does show that even some of the most controversial video games, like first-person shooter games, could have positive benefits on processing speed, other aspects of visual processing, reaction time beyond just responses, but even related to resistance of distraction and task switching. And that literature is actually pretty advanced, and I think it's quite strong. It doesn't mean that there's not also negative consequences. That's not saying that at all. But there is some growing evidence that the type of challenges that are placed on the brain by engaging in interactive media, including video games, could have benefits. Now, that could be offset by how long you play and the other important things in life that are being displaced by that. So those are very real concerns. But I was really intrigued by that data, that interactivity, essentially experiences could be used to improve the brain. Now, we know that for a long time. We have ancient practices like meditation and other forms of mindfulness practice that are built on that same premise. I mean, they're not video games in their original creation, but they were interactive experiences that helped improve cognition. And even things like therapy and education itself are experiential treatments in a way. So the idea that an interactive experience delivered through technology, through a digital means, could help your brain is not actually such a big leap. But as everything in the world, the devils are in the details. And saying video games is like saying drugs or food. It's a massive category. Many, many different types. You probably are aware of games like Minecraft, which are called sandbox games, where you are largely creative and don't really have defined goals. And other games like first-person shooters, which are very fast and use a lot of processing abilities. Other strategy games that you can play with people at the same time all around the world. So there's many, many different genres. And what we're doing now at Neuroscape, which is the center that I run at UCSF, is from scratch, and actually our games don't have violence. We don't think that's a critical ingredient. We build interactive experiences that we deliver through video game mechanics, art, music, story, reward, that are targeted at different brain networks, including things like attention. And then we build them, and then we show through very careful randomized control research that they can actually improve attention and working memory and other aspects of decision making. We first showed that in older adults in a paper that we published in Nature in 2013, and now we have many studies with children showing some of the same benefits. And maybe just to wrap that up with the sort of highest level goal of all this is a company that I started to move this into the world has now completed a phase 3 FDA research trial with one of our games showing in data that we reported in December that we can actually improve attention in children that have ADHD using this video game type of technology compared to a control group. And we're now seeking FDA approval for that, which, if approved, could happen over this year, will be the first non-drug treatment for ADHD. So it's a really interesting story to think about flipping technology around, taking some of the burden off of parents and physicians who really have one treatment, which is drugs, small molecules and chemicals that they rely on to treat things like ADHD and depression. So hopefully we're looking at another category of medicine built around technology, the positive side of it.
Congratulations.
It's really cool.
Which leads to another question. Someone asked about gender differences with multitasking. Are women better at it than men, or vice versa? Is there any research on that?
I think you know, but I'll let you answer.
I have looked, it's been a while since I looked at that literature because I get asked the question a lot. And there are some differences in spatial attention and other abilities that sometimes bear out and sometimes get contradicted. But for pure multitasking, I have not seen. We have not seen it in our own data. I have not seen it in the literature at all. Some of it is confounded or complicated by not, so there's, I view that there's a difference between what we think of as cognition, which is just like, how does this machinery work? And then behavior, which is how do you use it? And how does it penetrate into your real world with all the other things going on? And so I think from a cognitive perspective, as far as I can tell, I don't see convincing signs in the literature, and it's been years since I looked, but there was not at the time. But the reason why that question is asked so frequently, it doesn't mean that women don't do it more frequently or even better, and some of it might be a decision. Some guys might be like, I don't multitask, I don't want to do any of those things, I just want to sit here and watch TV. So there are very complicated,
social roles and cultural.
Exactly, and that's what I think creates some of that perception. But from a pure brain point of view, I'm not convinced that there are gender differences.
Okay, thank you. Join me in thanking our panelists. They've just been terrific.
Bringing you the experts, changemakers, and disruptors of the digital age. This is CHM Revolutionaries. Join us next time.